This is on Imagination of the Healing Garden. I'm giving a speech. This is my speech. In 1998, I did not go to my senior prom. My owner claimed the weekend for himself. Instead, we went down to Virginia. I spent the weekend instead studying. He insisted that I watch Apocalypse Now for my studies. I watched Apocalypse Now and I could not walk away without this nagging thing in my head screaming at me, read Lord of the Flies again. So on the spot, I dropped everything and I went to the bookstore and I got Lord of the Flies. I remember that day so vividly. Of all the days in my past, this one is one of the most vivid days. The wind that day was, I couldn't even begin to tell you. It was so strong that standing still, it was pushing me across the parking lot. I had never known wind like that. I had to stand against the brick building for an hour waiting for the wind to calm down, and it took me over 3 hours just across the parking lot. I was in the hotel and the Barnes & Noble was across the other side of the parking lot. I got back and I read Lord of the Flies. And then I had this other screaming thing inside of me screaming, now watch the movie Instinct. So I did. Anthony Hopkins, Cuba Gooding Jr. I did all of this in one afternoon. Apocalypse Now, Lord of the Flies, Instinct. I put the books down, I put the movies down, and I just sat there so perplexed and went, well, who's right? Brando? Hopkins? Lord of the Flies was no help. That just articulated the magnitude of the topic. For every child who has read Lord of the Flies and hated it, it doesn't really make sense until you watch Apocalypse Now and Instinct with it. You need the trifecta. I did not know it then, but I was taking up a study that philosophers have been studying for over 2,000 years old, the dichotomy of good and evil. The question that was being asked was, are human beings inherently good or bad? According to Apocalypse Now, we are evil. And according to Instinct, we are good. Lord of the Flies did not help. It showed both sides of the same coin, and I was left with a bunch of crying children at the end. I had no idea. That was not helpful. 26 years of studying philosophy, psychology, sociology, love, hate, fear, Pythagorean psychology, power economics, the rise and fall of societies, the Roman empires, and every world religion you can possibly think of. There was very little I did not study over the next 30 years because I wanted to know which one was right, Brando or Hopkins. This morning, I was able to put together the last piece of my entire research. And then this afternoon, I spent it writing out the chain reaction of the beginning of the self when the parent first divides the self with the choice of do as I say or else, which leaves the logic of a child's mind divided between, oh no, I have to choose life or the self. And that is ultimately the question most people have to ask when they are 2 to 10 years old. The parent gives them an alternative that the child internalizes logically and literally to the point of, if I don't do X, abandon the self, then I will die. I was 8 when I had to make that choice. My best friend was 10 when she had to make that choice. I have spoken to many people, and almost every single person I have spoken to has confirmed, yeah, I remember having to make that choice. that something was said at some point. Eat your vegetables or you're going to have to find another place to live. Parents have no clue that what they are really saying to a child in those phrases is you're going to have to choose between life or the self. I remember when I was 8 trying to figure out how I was going to survive outside in the cold and if I would die. Children are very logical and literal. And as a result, their logic and their literal minds are very fragile at a very young age, and parents are oblivious to this. Children are very logical and very literal. So I realized the 3 pillars of mental health are logic, love, and freedom. I was able to trace all of mental illness to the complete destruction of logic, the complete destruction of love, and the complete destruction of freedom. That it all comes down to those 3 pillars. And that all 3 of those pillars are sustained properly on the 12 ethics. That the 12 ethics, when practiced, absolutely fortify those 3 mental health pillars. I called it Montoya Point. I recorded the research to break down the chain reaction, the chain of events, from A to B to C, catalyst, the whole chain reaction, so I would have documentation when I go back and break down the science of it. The math and the physics will be here any day now where I can write out the whole formula. And I posted it, wrapped up my theories. I could feel this massive chapter coming to the end, where I usually get a whole go bigger from the universe. Instead, I got, that'll do, pig. That'll do. Thank you. I'm so glad you approve. And I felt the chapter, the book, finally close. And then I was compelled to give this speech because you don't close this kind of work without giving a speech. And then while I was going back over, checking to make sure all my I's were dotted, T's were crossed, I saw one of my very first articles, the Rorschach Print Perspective. In January of 2002, that rapist, he had raped me on 9/11, and I was, in January, I heard him arguing with me. He stood on his pedestal, towering over me in the metaphor, and I just listened to what he was saying, and I had a thought in that moment of everything in our minds is just a Rorschach print. We're all just standing on pedestals, looking at this point of truth, every single one of us. Suddenly, his opinion was no better than mine. His thoughts were just thoughts. And I thought, if his thoughts are just thoughts and his perspective is just his perspective, then how is his perspective any different than mine? The hierarchy fell that day in my mind, and suddenly we were standing on equal footing. And the moment I stood on equal footing to my abuser, are we all listening? The moment I stood on equal footing to my abuser, I went, you have no authority. It's just an opinion. Oh, he screamed. Oh, he screamed. And I laughed and went, and that is just your opinion. And he screamed. He screamed a lot more. I laughed again and went, that is just your opinion. And he screamed. And I was immune to his authority. Authority, immunity. In that instant, I was no longer a slave to him. Stockholm Syndrome is a bitch. It is not being enamored with your captor. I could slap psychologists for that one. It is being caught in the forbidden fruit paradox, thinking that your opinion is somehow less valuable than somebody else's opinion. It is logic. It is absolutely logic. And when I presented my case for the Rorschach Print Perspective, that was the catalyst. I can't say it was the catalyst. I could say that 9/11 easily was the catalyst, that it was 9/11 that gave me this perspective. I could say that it was my reading Lord of the Flies, watching Apocalypse Now, and watching Instinct that was the catalyst. Or check per perspective. That was 22 years ago. And I have done nothing else but study everything in the world about the life, the universe, and everything to get me to this particular point where I can finally say, I understand the meaning of life. I get it. I know who we are. I know who is right. Because that question was still burning in my head 26 years later. Was Brando right, or was Hopkins? Are we good people? Yes. Yes, we are. We are good people. And I can prove it. Brando was wrong. And it took me 26 years to find out how. And I'm watching people. And the more I watch people, the more I'm just going, I know what you're really afraid of. What we're all are really afraid of. We are terrified that we're not good. That is our biggest fear. We are terrified that we're not good people. Yes, we are. We are good people. Hopkins was right. Hopkins was right. So now I can finally say to people, don't watch Apocalypse Now. Just watch Instinct. That's who we are. Watch Instinct. Thank you so much. And may the kindest of words always find you.